Hello, good evening. How's everyone doing? Good, good. What a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful time to be alive, to be a woman, to be a champion of women, to be an artist and creator, and what a beautiful time to have voice and to use your voice. Thank you, Alicia. And you guys, I think we should clap for that, right? And so I want to welcome you to the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the only museum dedicated to women artists. I'm Milani Douglas, the Director of Public Programs, and I want to thank you for this important conversation between Sarah Lewis and Rhea Combs. What a pivotal time to talk about vision, justice, and visual literacy as an integral part of citizenship. Lewis and Combs are doing such important work in the intersection of art, photography, film, and social change. We are in for a treat. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Both of our guests know about my enthusiasm through all of my texts and emails. And of course, I must ask, first of all, to see in the audience, who is here for the first time for a Fresh Talk? Is this your first? Wow, that's awesome. That's beautiful. And who is this your first time at the museum? Okay, good. Okay, good. Well, I want all of our regulars to give our new guests a hand and thank them for coming. Because we got a lot of regulars this time. This is good. And thank you for everyone that's here and watching online. Your support is invaluable. In addition, I would like to thank our generous donors who, their visionary donors and leadership gifts help launch and continue and sustain this initiative. Denise Littlefield-Sobel, the M.O. Dari Family Foundation, Arts Initiative, the Reva and David Logan Foundation, the Swartz Foundation, and the Bernstein Family Foundation. And it is my pleasure that Dan Logan is here today. Thank you. Of course, we have to give him a hand. None of this would be possible. We're able to do this and have the kind of gathering that we're able to because of how they've contributed. So thank you. We have a fabulous team that has put together a wonderful evening for you to enjoy. Even though I stand here by myself, only in this moment, I'm not alone. I want to thank my public programs manager. This is our last one together, Alicia Gregory. And so please give her a hand if every detail has gone across her desk. And our stage manager, Beth Ferrero, for being a top-notch team. And also, we have amazing volunteers and amazing intern, Noemi. So I'm thrilled at the work we get to do together. And now, to finally introduce the woman who steers this amazing ship, and she does a fantastic job of it, our museum director, Susan Sterling. I should say this, please silence your phones and post with Fresh Talk for Change. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome. Just a housekeeping matter. For those of you who are new, the Fresh Talk happens here in the performance hall. Then we go downstairs for Sunday supper, and then we have questions there for our two discussants. So that's how the afternoon runs into 8 o'clock this evening, and we really are looking forward to a terrific afternoon and evening. So I met Sarah Lewis a long time ago, and when I started not too long ago, she was 13 and I was 28. But importantly, when we first started talking about Fresh Talk, and this is our 4th year, 2 years ago we actually spoke with Sarah about participating in Fresh Talk at the museum because she had published her book entitled The Rise: Creativity, the Gift of Failure, and the Search for Mastery. And of course, here at the Women's Museum, the idea of mastery is interesting because, of course, there's also mystery, which has to do with old masters versus old mistresses. But they have totally different connotations. And that was actually, this book, The Rise, was actually what she had originally been invited to speak about. However, since then, Sarah has masterfully edited the landmark Vision and Justice issue of Aperture magazine, and has created a new primary source for exploring visual literacy and photography's history as a catalyst for change. In today's political and creative climate, where image-driven social media platforms are such an intense part of our everyday lives that they have become lifeblood to many in the United States, it is important to have conversations like this on visual literacy and the power of imagery. It's extremely timely, and it is exceedingly necessary, perhaps more necessary than any time in the past. Sarah Lewis, Assistant Professor of the History of Art and Architecture and African American Studies at Harvard University, is a leading voice on this topic. Her curatorial work and writing emphasize the power of photography in the past and its present and future possibilities. Sarah will be joined by Rhea Combs, curator of film and photography and director of the Center for African American Media Arts at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm sure she has fun saying that title. Through her curatorial work, Rhea has used film and photography to connect a sometimes hidden past to our ever-evolving present, sharing a legacy that is ever relevant to the world. Prepare yourself, as Milani said, for an engaging dialogue. And when you join us for Sunday supper, please bring your questions and your solutions to share. Rhea Combs and Sarah Lewis are sure to provide you with additional material as they have their conversation this afternoon. I'd like to turn the stage over to Rhea. Her presentation will be followed by Sarah Lewis's, and then we will be party to a conversation between the two of them that promises to be illuminating on the topic of vision and justice. Thank you. Rhea?
I think you're on, okay, and then I'll just push back. Okay, there you go.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming. It is my pleasure to be here with you. And I'm delighted to share the stage with my colleague and friend, Sarah Lewis, and discuss this important topic of vision and justice. I'm also thankful that she has edited such an important issue for Aperture. Thank you as well to the Board of Trustees, the Museum Director, Susan Fisher-Sterling, and Milani Douglas, along with everyone here at the National Museum of Women in the Arts who's helped to make this possible. I'd like to begin my brief remarks by showing a clip from a female filmmaker named Madeline Anderson. Many may never have heard of her, but she's a documentary filmmaker with an incredible film career who worked with some of the most respected documentarians like Shirley Clark, Richard Leacock, and the Maisel brothers. She is one of who were all the pioneers of a genre called direct cinema. But Madeline rarely received any of her own recognition. So this film that I'm going to show you, she filmed this documentary, I Am Somebody, in the summer of 1969, during a time when race, gender, and class collided in South Carolina, and Black healthcare workers protested for better wages.
I feel that the Black woman in our nation, the Black working woman, is perhaps the most discriminated against of all of the working women the black woman. And
in this documentary, as I mentioned, I wanted to show us this work that really brings to the fore Coretta Scott King, in fact, in a way that we often don't even see her speaking sort of front and center. I thought it was also important to showcase this work because I recently honored the 91-year-old female filmmaker who made this work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture during our first African American Film Festival. It was an important decision to sort of showcase and honor her, but also bring this clip to the fore because it was shot nearly 50 years ago. And the message is a timeless one. It shows women at the forefront fighting for justice. Coretta Scott King had come down to South Carolina in support of these healthcare workers who had sacrificed their lives and their livelihood to go on strike to advocate for a living wage. To me, that's vision and justice. This film shows King, as this is a short documentary, it shows King marching in the front line, on the front lines, locked arms in arms with these women who had been, before she arrived, being brutalized and beaten and silenced. She came along with Andrew Young and Ralph Abernathy. Madeline Anderson came along as well, and at the time was pregnant. And she went down to make this film because, as she told me, as a Black working woman, a wife, and a mother, I knew their story. Their story was my story. And again, for her being a filmmaker, that meant showing the humanity and pride of Black people and using the camera to combat injustice. And I think that is a tradition that is something that dates back centuries. So to move forward, I want to start by saying I started my career as a curator about 2 decades ago. I was drawn to museum work because I wanted to blend the practice of theory and practical application, but also because as a young girl growing up in Detroit, I would spend hours flipping through magazines and books trying to better understand the world around me. I loved the variety of images of Black women I would see on album covers and books by Black women writers like Toni Cade Bambara, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, just to name a few. But also there was a Diego Rivera mural at the Detroit Institute of Art that was a source of pride and inspiration, not only because of its message of recognizing the working class, but its size and scale felt also like a vision of justice. These themes of recognizing the extraordinary in the ordinary, the power of the image as a window into humanity, and realizing representation matters are the critical ways in which I approach my curatorial practice. I also understand that life is a journey, and having a strong sense of the past helps navigate the world as we move forward. So for me, that history is anchored in when and where I entered, to borrow a phrase from womanist scholar Paula Giddens. And that takes me to my immediate family. My maternal great-grandmother and my grandmother are both sources of inspiration. This image of my great-grandmother was taken around 1910-11. She was originally from Frankfort, Kentucky, named Fannie Bell Martin. And she was a widow who had to raise my grandmother and worked in the factories. But it was through that tireless work that she was able to raise enough money and purchase a home. In the shadows of this image of my grandmother and great-grandmother, you see the house that she used, that she created a safe space for Blacks migrating from the South to the North for better opportunities. This picture of my great-grandmother and grandmother show for me a big bigger sense of sort of one's humanity. These are the image I showed before, as well as this image, are not the images I knew of my grandmother and great-grandmother. However, they provide me with a better sense of understanding sort of this arc of history, this arc of justice, if you will, that is ever-reaching and quite broad. And it's an American story for me because it connects us to work, opportunity, resilience, fortitude, and these are things that are also of which I'm intimately connected. And so it's that sort of work that brings me to sort of the work I do at the museum. I also recognize that America is complicated by her peculiar history, and it's a nation of promise and hope. And it's also a place that has kept a large swath of its citizens on the legal and social margins. This image was the first image that welcomed me at my desk when I came to the museum almost 6 years ago. And I was struck by this 1850s tintype of this young girl, probably in her teens, and someone has taken the care to paint this work, hand paint the earrings and the necklace and the ring. But it also reminded me of this phrase by W.E.B. Du Bois that describes this paradox, the souls that he describes in his tomb, the souls of black folks, where he wrote, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." This young girl, with her focused eyes, clearly looks as though she is one of strength, fortitude, and resilience. And it's that focus that many African Americans have navigated and negotiated during this particular tension. And I think that photography is one medium that most effectively documents these noteworthy characteristics. So we have vintage photographs like this image, but we also have images like this that I find so powerful. This Zune Lee image that was taken during the uprisings in Ferguson after the killing of Michael Brown. So agency and activism have become and have been seen as has been seen through the power of the lens. As statesmen and abolitionist Frederick Douglass argued in 1865 of the photography's importance, particularly for African Americans, pictures fundamentally determine what it means to be human. But not only that, they also hold an important space in promoting social reform. Even in some of the most challenging moments in American history, the gaze, one's posture, a gesture, perhaps like a bended knee, or an article of clothing, can demonstrate a tradition of resilience and determination. According to Douglass, one of the most photographed men of the 19th century, the power of the photograph is that it allows the subject to control the meaning and assert their citizenship. In other words, as feminist scholar Bell Hooks wrote, camera gave to black folks, irrespective of class, a means by which we could participate fully in the production of images. But it is also critical in my curatorial practice to include work that is not only ranging in scope, but it shows a variety of ages that have been actively involved in envisioning our justice. But we also want to use the camera as a weapon against injustice. So these are just a few examples of the ways in which we have been collecting work. The previous work, as well as this one, is by the Baltimore-based photographer Devin Allen during this photograph was taken during the uprisings that took place after the shooting of Freddie Gray. I find it strikingly familiar and similar to this image by Don Hogan Charles of that was taken in the summer of 1967 in Newark. And then you have these images, again, this one by Sheila Pre-Bright, where you have young people, intergenerations, fighting and arguing and using the camera and their voice to fight against injustice. And again, historically, we can look to the past to think about what's happening now. We think of this Spider Martin image with John Lewis being confronted by the police or confronting the police. Or we have this one with the ultimate side eye that was given by Gloria Richardson Dandridge, the freedom fighter in Cambridge, Maryland, as she was fighting for equal rights for housing and fighting against housing discrimination. All of these things, again, these were images from the 60s and from the present, but they bring me to this image by J.P. Ball. And when I think about the significance of photography, I often give pause at the fact that Black people have been agents in creating images for decades, be they still or moving. For some of the 19th century images, I'm struck when I see this beautiful one of this woman that was taken in Helena, Montana, around 1887. I can't help but wonder about her life. Did she make that dress? What is the pin? And we've been actually trying to zoom and study because it looks like it has a bit of a military sort of sword sort of symbol. So what is her affiliation? Was someone involved in the war? Who is she? What is her name? How did she get to Helena, Montana? And where is her family now? These are important questions to ask and seek answers about because it reframes and expands narratives surrounding American history. Who's America and who's American? So unfortunately, I don't know much about her, but I know that J.P. Ball was an activist and a photographer. Ball was born in 1825 in Frederick County, Virginia, and learned the art of the daguerreotype by another free man of color, John Bailey. By the age of 20, Ball opened his first photography studio in Cincinnati, Ohio, a city that was heavily involved in anti-slavery activity. The business failed, however, but he became an itinerant photographer, traveling to various parts of the South and Midwest. He served as the official photographer for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And his services were highly sought after by people like Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett. Ball eventually moved west with his son, J.P. Ball Jr., and they set up a shop in Helena, Montana, around 1887. Ball was quite politically active in Montana. He promoted Blacks moving to the West for a better life. He was active in pushing to make Helena the state's capital. His son was the editor of the African-American newspaper in the area called The Colored Citizen. The elder Ball was eventually nominated for political office as a city coroner by the Republican Party, which I will say he declined. Unfortunately, he was eventually forced out of town for his photographic work, for creating a three-part photograph of a fellow Montanan named William Biggerstaff. He showed Biggerstaff sitting for a photo in the Ball studio, quite gorgeous, handsome, dapper gentleman. Then he showed him hanging from a rope with two white men next to him. Then he showed him lying dead in his coffin, all in the same three-piece suit. He is also wearing, as you can note, his wedding ring. This small image immediately makes you wonder, who did he leave behind? Was it the woman in the previous image? These are the things that Roland Barthes would call a punctum, or an indelible impression. Through the set of images, the framing of the photograph, Biggerstaff's image of this, or Biggerstaff as a man is humanized. Oftentimes, the spectacle of the heinous crime is what was sent out and promoted, and the covered image, this man's face covered, he's no longer sort of considered human. But what Ball has done here, as he has shown this trajectory of, did this happen the same day? What were the circumstances behind this? And through the power of using J.P. Ball using his camera as a weapon to fight injustice, he was run out of town. And I think this then becomes sort of the ways in which we can understand the power of photography. We can use the photography as a way to try and right wrongs. I will end by showing this last sort of case study of this photographer from a different time period, if you will, from Henry Clay Anderson, who shot photographs primarily in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in Mississippi. And he was this was one of the actual first major photography acquisitions by the museum. And so we have over 5,000 images by Henry Clay Anderson. He was a minister, a photographer, but he also really, I think, did another important aspect, again, of reframing people's understandings of sort of life, African-American life. Oftentimes when we think in our visual imagination of Mississippi or segregated South, you're not necessarily thinking about thriving communities or Black folks on motorcycles hanging out in front of their own photo store. But this is what, in fact, Anderson was looking to do, really kind of create opportunities to show a different story, a more fuller picture of African-American life. So a lot of his images were really of, you know, sort of pageants and proms, again, everyday lives, making the extraordinary out of the ordinary. But there was one day when he took this picture, which I found to be is one of the most profound images, because he's showing violence without us seeing the victim. In fact, you know, prior to that, you may say that he was doing what Frederick Douglass would call sort of pictures with progress. But this one was really a startling image that he could not help but feel compelled to take. This was an image of a gentleman who later we find out was Reverend George Lee. He had been driving from Bologna, Mississippi, and he, in fact, was shot by a couple of men that were part of the White Citizens Council for trying to register to vote. He and his friend were involved in voting rights. His friend Gus Courts were involved in voting rights and voter registration, focusing primarily on this town. They drove up, and as they were driving to their house, there was these two buckshots taken to his car. His car ran into a pole, and this is how Henry Clay Anderson was able to take this photograph with the street light as his sort of the light source for him to take this photograph. I should say, this case is considered a cold case, a civil rights cold case. This incident was just one of several murders that occurred in Mississippi in 1955, including Emmett Till in August and Lamar Smith also in August. So it is this sort of work, this kind of opportunity for photographers to take their tool, if you will, and mark the moments of what has been taking place over the course of time, and using that to humanize and really recognize the ways in which it's our responsibility as artists, or it can be our responsibility as artists, to sort of use that tool as a way to create opportunities for activism, for agency, and for us to each understand our roles to fully recognize each and every citizen as part of this country. Thank you so much.
Is this one going to go first or this one? Okay. Keep it dark for a second. Whenever you're ready to play it, just go ahead. Just push play. Okay. You can just push that whenever you're
Okay. All right. At this point, I think I can say good evening. It's a true honor to be here and such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Susan Fisher-Sterling, to Milani Douglas, who I feel very much are now both colleagues and friends. I met Susan now when I was, yes, maybe 13. And you don't know it, but you inspired me so much regarding modeling what excellence and leadership looks like for a woman. So thank you. Thank you. It's a true pleasure for me to be in conversation with my colleague and friend, Rhea Combs. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. I will do the same, offer you a sense of the framework for my work, and leave hopefully adequate time for questions and our conversation. I'd like to give you a sense of what brought me to edit the Vision and Justice issue of Aperture. And I'll do so by just framing it around a simple question that animates my thinking. Can art measure human life? It's not a question that we ask very often. We often think of measuring human life through vastly different means. Earning power, or mortality rates, demography. But I think we're living in a moment today where we see the ways in which the image has been inaugurated as one of our main tactics for determining who counts in society, which is a mode of measuring human life. I want to think about this idea in a contemporary sense, which I'll do at the end, but really begin with the historic roots of this idea. And for that, I'm going to start with a short clip.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are created equal. That they are endowed by the Creator
with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life,
liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
We, therefore,
the representatives of the United States of America,
for the support of this declaration,
mutually pledge to each other
our lives,
our fortunes,
and our sacred honor.
Extraordinary, isn't it? And it's not meant to be an ad for Ancestry.com, but we should give it up for them for having created this with Droga 5, the creative agency. Why do you think this template of citizenship is being presented to us as a John Trumbull painting? The signing of the Declaration of Independence, which hangs in the Capitol here, you're seeing at the center. The commercial shows us the transit from that moment to the current day, where you see the descendants of those signers and pictured here in the Second Continental Congress in the near precise positions of the painting. 1790, citizenship is defined as being white and being male and being able to hold property. Is the journey from that day to the current one simply a legal narrative? Or is it also a cultural one? What are the episodes along that journey that let us see the ways in which we have pushed for a more inclusionary model of citizenship? This is how I teach the class at Harvard, Vision and Justice, thinking through these episodes and structuring it along those lines. But it has become the framework for understanding the creation of the Vision and Justice issue as well. I was oriented to think through this idea, and I'll speak about the issue more in depth in a bit, because of the life of a man who I would be remiss in not thanking as I continue, and that man is Shadrach Emanuel Lee. He's my grandfather. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, far less cool name than Shadrach Emanuel Lee. But I have his initials deliberately, S-E-L, and this is him pictured here. You can tell who he is because I have his big forehead. Thank you very much. Genetics. But with my great-grandfather, all here from the island of Montserrat, that small volcanic island in the Caribbean. Here, shown in Brooklyn, New York, in around 1910. He asked a question of his history teacher in the 11th grade, which animates my life journey. He wanted to know why the history textbooks presented excellence just one way. He wanted to know where African Americans were, where Asian Americans were, where Latinos were, where Native Americans were, where the whole world was. And the answer he received was that African Americans in particular had done nothing to merit inclusion. Didn't sit well with him. So he asked the question again and again. And he was expelled for his impertinence in refusing to accept the answer. He never went back to high school. He never received a GED or college degree, but he became an artist. I'd like to think of him as a proto-Kehinde Wiley because he would insert into the very images that we might not see depicted with people of color, the very people of color that he knew should be there. He also became a jazz musician, playing backup with Count Basie and Duke Ellington, and I began to wonder, because of the force and the energy that he seemed to derive by creating images that better approximated his image of who counts in society, whether we weren't doing enough to understand the importance, the gravitas of images for justice in society. I think it is also a testament to this country that 2 generations later I can be teaching these very topics at Harvard with a grandfather who's expelled for wanting to do so. Whether or not you have a story like this in your own life, I think we've recently been treated to images that remind us of the importance of images to inaugurate an expanded notion of who counts in society, of course showing you Amy Sherrill's masterful painting of Michelle Obama, lovingly gazed upon by President Obama. But perhaps more so, through this image, are we reminded of the ways in which images can inaugurate new possibilities. We're looking at a young 2-year-old Parker Curry who was gazing at this painting so much so that her mother couldn't get her to turn around and face the camera, or the phone really, because she knew she was looking at a queen. That's what she said to her mother. But what I'd like to know, perhaps one day I can ask her mother, is why this image was set a detonation beyond the mastery that Amy Sherrill has used here. What images might she have been naturally surrounded by that made this image force her to stand at attention at that young age of 2? What I'd like to do now is just take you through a few case studies that get us to think about the work, the catalytic role of images for inaugurating new possibilities for collective society. I should also just say, parenthetically, Susan mentioned that initially I was asked to speak about The Rise, and that book is about mastery and failure. And what that book allowed me to consider was the ways in which the arts have allowed us to overcome moments of collective failure, which is at the heart of justice. Think about this in the life of a young boy named Charles Black Jr., who was himself in college in Austin, Texas, going to a dance, admittedly just to meet some girls, and found himself just instead transfixed by the power of this trumpet player, whom he had never heard of before. Turns out it was Louis Armstrong, king of the trumpet, and the year was 1931, and he knew that there was genius coming out of the body of this black man. And because of that nearly alone, he felt that segregation must be wrong. Now, he was standing next to a friend of his from Austin High who recognized that genius too, but instead shook his head and uttered an epithet about African Americans commonly used during the day, but Charles Black Jr. knew. He decided that that would be the moment in which he began walking towards justice. He would go on to become one of the lawyers for the Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, that would go on to outlaw segregation. And he would inaugurate Louis Armstrong as the man who inspired this life-changing shift. He would teach at Columbia and Yale, and he would have an annual Armstrong Listening Night to honor the role that he played in his life. How many movements began when a work of art with aesthetic force so shifted someone's notions of the world entirely that we began a movement, that we created a leader? Often we fail to acknowledge the importance of images or performances, the arts, because we don't herald the private encounters in which these shifts occur that lead to public change. Frederick Douglass had a sense of this. During the Civil War, first in 1861 and again in 1865, he delivered a speech entitled Pictures in Progress in Boston's Tremont Temple, that integrated church 1 block from Boston Commons. That surprised his audience. They expected him to speak about anything else, really, but he spoke about what would have seemed like a trifle in the face of that nation-severing conflict. Namely, pictures and the force they have in the imagination. As my colleagues, Henry Louis Gates Jr., John Stauffer, Celeste Marie Bernier have discovered, Douglass is the most photographed man in the 19th century. Not African-American man, American man. And why is this? What did Douglass know about, as Rhea Combs put it, the fact that representation matters? What sense of agency did he derive from creating a counter-narrative that would go against the racist stereotypes that were being used to legitimate and to justify the exclusion of African Americans from citizenship? Here he is in his study in his final home in Anacostia, as I imagine him redrafting the speech, as he did 3 times over the course of his life. Why would Douglass think about the importance of pictures at that moment? Well, we can speak about that a bit in the conversation, but I'd like to leave in your mind's eye an image that performs some of this work. Images were being used as a kind of data. They were being weaponized to naturalize the sense of racial hierarchies that we are still challenged to combat today. This image, taken by the South Carolina-based Joseph T. Zealy, was commissioned by, in fact, my predecessor at Harvard, Louis Agassiz, to try to prove polygenesis, to prove that African Americans were a separate, lower species. Here we're looking at Jack, a driver on a plantation, one of a set of father and daughter pairs that were, well, African and American born. I'll show you here an image of Renty on the left and the series created by Carrie Mae Weems, From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, that reframes this body of work to honor them, as Douglass was himself, with images that were functioning as correctives against these mental images, these stereotypes that were being codified through photography, happening at the same time as the masterful work of a J.P. Ball, right? Now, the work of images to move us past societal failure is something that came to mind here, and this is just for a bit of levity because it's a heavy topic we're speaking about tonight. When I saw this transcript of Martin Luther King's from seminary. Now, you might be too far in the back to see, but in a transcript of A's and B's, he received 2 C's in, guess what class? Public speaking. Yeah, not once, but twice. So C+ to C. Shouldn't this be at the museum, Rhea? I was stunned to see it and felt almost embarrassed to be looking at it. But of course, you have to wonder what that teacher thought when he went on to lead the nation with the power of his spoken truth. And what King must have thought when he knew who he was, as you imagine he did, and received those grades. But it made me think about the fact that I don't know where we would be without the prodigious work of the arts, and oratory is one of them, for pushing past rational argument alone to get us to see past our blind spots, to inaugurate a new moment of justice. With the time I have remaining, I'd like to just present images that might speak to those in the room, although maybe there are none in here, who might not yet buy the argument, who might not think that images are important for justice. I'd call your attention to images that have been so impactful in American history regarding the agitational work that they performed about belonging and inclusion, that they were censored. Take, for example, the images that Dorothea Lange was commissioned to create to document Japanese internment. We're looking at the Shibuya family in front of their home in 1942, a family that was interned. Remember this policy, interned. 2/3 of them were American citizens. This image was impounded by the government after she took it, as was this image of a Japanese businessman being tagged for removal. Migrant mother, of course, is what she's better known for, but this image as well was impounded by the government. And we can maybe speak about the visual rhetoric at work that offers a declamative, a mode of desire to proclaim entrance into the category of citizenship. Just for context, this is the ways in which photographs were also being used at the time. Think back to Joseph T. Zealy, whose image I just showed you. Consider the ways in which these photographs are being used to instruct the American public about who is an enemy and who is a neighbor or a citizen, in showing the distinction between Chinese nationals and Japanese nationals. It's not very long ago this occurred. We have here in Washington artists, of course, who have performed and created the headwaters of the legacy that we'll be speaking about today with the contemporary photographers who continue this work, and say Gordon Parks. We also have photographers who allow us to consider how this impacts our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and looking at the history of how we've both naturalized the sense of the need to, or the legitimate manifest destiny that was allowed for the expansion of the American West. Here you're looking at the Francis Benjamin Johnston image of, as the caption states, 7 little Indians in 4 different stages of civilization. They're showing you a telos of so-called progress, of so-called civilization, namely assimilation. And the Edward Curtis body of work as well uses photographs to naturalize what I would call of course, an injustice. Here, the vanishing race Navajo, through the vanishing point of the image, suggesting the kind of natural state of extinction here, or of incursion onto what is rightfully native land. And we could also speak about the ways in which Ellis Island created images as a form of data to document who was allowed to enter and who was not. This topic that we're speaking about is crucial today. We make as many images in 3 minutes as are made in the entire 19th century. We are awash with images, as much as perhaps Frederick Douglass felt that he was. And so for me, it was a natural yes when Michael Famighetti at Aperture and Chris Spood asked me to guest edit this issue. I did agitate for 2 covers, though. They typically have 1. This is the Richard Avedon cover that shows, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. with his father and a son, insistently gazing out on us, as I hoped it reminded us of the fact that we are in lineage with this larger idea, and that this is, of course, a historic topic. But through the second cover, I attempted to show that this is also a contemporary one. An image here by Ewell Orescu, a former student of mine at Yale, who's Ethiopian-born and LA-based, and he's known for kind of breaking the internet with all his photographs of Beyonce pregnant. If you've seen those, that's Ewell. He's often known for images like this that appropriate Grandmaster paintings. Here, his sister actually in the frame, entitled "Girl with a Bamboo Earring." But the work of the issue is to consider, through the framework of Frederick Douglass's idea about the importance of images for justice, the prodigious works of contemporary photographers who are taking up this mantle, such as Ewell Rescue, and filmmakers like Ava DuVernay and Bradford Young, photographers like Dina Lawson, and to marry their work with the lyricism of scholars and poets and writers such as Claudia Rankine, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and others. My hope is that together it gives us a sense of how images have actually structured the very contours of society. Because I don't have time to take you through it, I just want to leave you with one kind of emblematic image and then show you a clip that my students and I put together for the Kennedy Center. This image, for me, summarizes what every photographer is effectively stating. Many of you have probably seen it. Here we're looking at a young Jacob Philadelphia, just 5 years old, having been allowed to ask the president just one question. I imagine he had many. Of the president. And here he's decided to ask whether the president's hair texture really does match his own. And gallantly, President Obama is leaning down to let him touch the evidence. It's framed masterfully by Pete Souza, former White House photographer, and you see he's included the Oval Office seal, of course, on the carpet, and his brother gazing on, whose life path, as you can imagine, this Jacob Philadelphia's was, is likely altered in that moment. His parents as well, of course, in the frame. What, as was the case with the 2-year-old Parker Curry, might Jacob Philadelphia have been surrounded by regarding images that made him need to touch the evidence? Right? What work does an image perform that inaugurates new possibility? And just one more for fun. I performed a similar work here, too. You might not have seen this one. Have you seen it? No? Yes? No? This is of a young girl who was in kindergarten and was visiting the White House with her parents, part of the Wounded Veterans event, and she was worried that she was going to get in trouble for missing a day of school, and so she asked the president to write her a note so she wouldn't get in trouble. Now, I hope the museum here invites her at some point in her life to speak, because I wonder, I actually know what she's going to do with her life. Look at that self-possession. And look at how seriously he's taking the task. 5 years old, and she can command the president to do this. Okay. So, I love her spirit, dressed to the nines. But again, framed masterfully by Pete Souza with the painting of George Washington in the far background, with the veterans in the midground, as if suggesting the journey and narrative that's allowed us to arrive at this moment, the sacrifice required. When the Vision and Justice issue of Aperture came out, it was a surprise to me that it performed the kind of work it did in the world. It sold 20,000 copies in 7 weeks. It's in its 3rd printing right now. It's now being sold as a book as opposed to a magazine issue. And Rhea and I might speak about some of the other initiatives that are coming out of it. But one surprise as well was that the Kennedy Center wanted to create a multimedia piece out of the issue. And so, in collaboration with my students, we set to this speech given by John F. Kennedy to eulogize Robert Frost, entitled Power and Poetry, Images from the Vision and Justice issue of Aperture. This speech by President Kennedy speaks to the role of the artist for justice, and it's a very short clip. So I'm going to play that for you now, and because no one can really follow Kennedy, I'm not going to say very much afterwards. I might need some help toggling between. Okay. Oh. Yeah. Okay. It's right there. I'm going to go to the desktop.
This one?
Yeah, or that one. The desktop.
If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society? It is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist. If art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. We must never forget that art is not a form of propaganda, it is a form of truth. And as Mr. McLeish once remarked, of poets, there is nothing worse for our trade than to be in style. In free society, art is not a weapon, and it does not belong to the sphere of polemics and ideology. Artists are not engineers of the soul. It may be different elsewhere, but democratic society, in it, the highest duty of the writer, the composer, the artist, is to remain true to himself and to let the chips fall where they may. In serving his vision of the truth, the artist best serves his nation. And the nation which disdains the mission of art invites the fate of Robert Frost's hired man, the fate of having nothing to look backward to with pride and nothing to look forward to with hope. I look forward to a great future for America, a future in which our country will match its military strength with our moral restraint, its wealth with our wisdom, its power with our purpose. I look forward to an America which will not be afraid of grace and beauty, which will protect the beauty of our natural environment, which will preserve the great old American houses and squares and parks of our national past, and which will build handsome and balanced cities for our future. I look forward to an America which will reward achievement in the arts as we reward achievement in business or statecraft. I look forward to an America which will steadily raise the standards of artistic accomplishment and which will steadily enlarge cultural opportunities for all of our citizens. And I look forward to an America which commands respect throughout the world, not only for its strength, but for its civilization as well. And I look forward to a world which will be safe, not only for democracy and diversity, but also for personal distinction.
So my hope is that you can now see why I don't believe in the arts as merely a respite from life, a kind of luxury, but instead see the arts as, in fact, the tactics that we use to create the more just society in which we are honored to live. Thank you.
Rhea, if you can join Sarah on stage. While they're getting my, that was fantastic. Wow. Just to give you all some directions, after the conversation, we are going to take questions downstairs in the Great Hall over dinner. So you have a few minutes to get settled downstairs. And at 6:30, we'll start the question-answer period. And also, like Susan said, please bring your solutions as well. Please bring your ideas and what you're working on. We have some of the most brilliant people that are working in DC, and as we know, DC being local is global, so we know that in this audience are some of the answers that we're all seeking for. So just asking for you all to bring that with you to be a part of that conversation. Thank you.
Finally.
Hey, yes indeed.
Oh, I've been so looking forward to this.
Yes, same. This was great. And I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you.
Likewise.
It's been 10 years since we realized it's been about 10 years since we saw each other.
How is it possible? But you know what? Actually, is this mic on, by the way? Yes? Okay. It actually speaks to the ways in which people like us who do work that looks at the intersection of citizenship, race, and image making are tasked with going around the country right now, so much so that we don't even see each other the way that we need to.
It's true. I mean, it does speak to the importance of this work and the timeliness and of this. So I wanted to sort of just start by asking you, really sort of very eloquently explain sort of the genesis and the sort of impetus behind creating Vision and Justice. But now, how does that sort of play itself out in the classroom? And, you know, as someone, as I was saying to you before, I'm like, you know, Sarah, you went to Harvard for undergrad, and now you're teaching at Harvard. And how did that sort of, these sort of different chapters impact either the work that you, and the choice to do a project like Vision and Justice, or how you take that to your justice work on campus?
Yes, thank you. It's such a thrill to be able to talk with you about this. So, great question. Harvard and teaching there inspired the Vision and Justice issue. Yes, it was a response to a request to edit, but I said yes because I had already been envisioning that Vision and Justice would be my first course at Harvard. I was a student at Harvard. I majored in, or as they say, my concentration, little nomenclature at Harvard was art history, but I never had a course like this there. And I wanted to teach what I was not given as information when I was there at the time. The course, Vision and Justice, predates the issue. I decided to create it. I had the syllabus ready and effectively transferred much of the thinking into the issue itself. But I do want to make sure I convey the kind of surprise of teaching here. When I walked in that first day to teach this course, I had no idea that the room would look like the world. The students that had gathered to take the class showed no dominant racial majority. They were equal parts black, white, Asian.
So that's very different than your experience when...
Oh, well, I mean, Harvard's very inclusive. That's true. The student body is very inclusive. But I don't think I'd been in a classroom. You know, this is a couple hundred students that replicated that. And it showed me as the course, and I can say more about the course. It's now one of the required courses at Harvard. It's a core curriculum class, which happened after 1 year.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's so fun.
Oh, God.
I'm sort of pausing as I speak about it, I have to be honest, because I'm on sabbatical right now. So I'm like, yeah, let me just go back to it. Yeah, so it's a core curriculum class now. It's also a civic class. I teach it at public libraries around the country. Brooklyn Public Library was first, Jackson, Mississippi, and others. But the course really transformed my thinking about how crucial this topic is for African American life, yes, but for really all kind of rights-based modes of engagement. So,
I mean, which really, in my brain, sort of made me think about the very aspirational tone in which Kennedy's speech is sort of really evoking, and this is kind of the manifestation of what he is really sort of calling as this sort of call to action, if you will.
Yes, I get chills as you say that. Yes, it is. That's exactly right.
Aside from the fact that I must say, I don't know, your presentation really made me miss 44.
I know.
44, Obama. Yes. I mean, it was just, this was a moment where I just thought, my God, looking at, you know, even the way in which the presidency was photographed, that the office was documented
Yes.
in a way that kind of showcased everyday moments, you know, and humanized and made leadership feel like something that's attainable, which I think what we were both talking about is the way in which these images help us to reframe and reconfigure what is possible.
And that was the second impetus behind the issue in Aperture's mind. They wanted to mark the ending of the Obama presidency. And it was designed to do that. It performed work beyond that as well in the end, but that was part of the rationale. And so I commissioned, with Michael Famicchetti, of course, Maurice Berger to reflect upon the role of the photograph in the Obama presidency. So the Obama bookends the issue ultimately, and Frederick Douglass constitutes the other. So you're exactly right. It's teaching vision and justice, though, at the moment of this shift between these two presidents created a different level of urgency in my mind about this work. I had students who refused to go to other classes in November 2016 because they were so distraught, but they came to my class because they wanted something out of it. They wanted a way forward out of it. They wanted a sense of hope and possibility that the image offers. So it tasked me with considering the work, the constant futurity of this idea. And that's what you hear, as you stated in the President Kennedy's speech, a sense that we still have work to do.
Right.
And that we know and we need to honor the role of the artist in doing that.
I mean, that's the thing, you know, really thinking about the ways in which art is so critical to, you know, asking difficult questions, pointing the frame, the lens, the paintbrush onto sort of the way in which society is functioning, but also could, you know, sort of see itself. So there's always this tension, it seems like, between sort of, again, questions around citizenry, solving or engaging with problems, but then looking at sort of what some possibilities are.
Yes, and this is so much of what we look to, the extraordinary museum that you work at and the collection that you're building for. You know, the moment that we're in, I think, forces us, because of the ease with which we can see images through our phones, to encounter moments of injustice, right? The moments of racial terror that have been that we've been saturated by have come to us because of the moving image, because of the still image. But they're images that can counterbalance that, right?
Absolutely.
And this is what you're putting on the walls of the museum, and this is what's in the issue. So it unites our practice.
Thank you. We're united. We're reunited. I think I agree with you. I think that is in part, you know, for me, in bringing collections of film is so critical, and I didn't show it in here, but there is a whole initiative to bring forward home movies, and that is a huge, I think, effort on our behalf to kind of chart and sort of envision the way in which the museum is engaged by the visitor. And so I think home movies becomes an important way that we understand all of the variety of stories that can be told, and that you're really allowing these everyday sort of American experiences, in our instance, to be sort of shown through the lens of the amateur photographer or amateur image maker, but yet and still it still has this sort of promise and hope of sort of how these ordinary experiences really shape and mold all of us. And they really, in my brain, bring us together because they become these universal experiences, you know, birthdays and holiday celebrations and vacations. And for many people of color, those sort of narratives help to counterbalance these these other grand stories that have been told. But at the same time, they're also providing a point of entry for people of all over the world to be able to make connections with individuals that they may not have otherwise felt there was a relationship with.
Yeah, there's so much to say here. I wish we had all night. We could just bring our sleeping bags and keep talking. But here, I'm reminded of the importance of work by, of course, Deborah Willis, who we'll speak about more. Yes, yes. Snaps and claps for. I mean, she's the headwaters of the entire field that we're speaking about here.
It's so true.
You know, at the end, I should say, at the end of Frederick Douglass's speech, he said poignantly he thought it might take over 150 years for someone to come and better articulate what he had in mind. Very humble. And I'd like to think it is a scholar like Deborah Willis.
Without question, you know, who looked at it and said, wait a minute.
Yeah, and she looked at these images that were in the home, right, as much as she did works that were in the public realm to create this field. There's also the work of Bell Hooks, who's looked at the walls as a site of resistance in African-American homes in the absence of, say, a Smithsonian, you know, to create these counter-narratives. That essay, In Our Glory, is one that I assigned to the students. So it's as if the ideas that we've been reading about, that have understood, has created the field, is now manifest in the museum that you're working in.
Well,
it's amazing.
Well,
so,
you know, I think,
thank you.
Well, I didn't build it, but you know, I know what you mean. Yes, I think one of the sort of metaphors that the museum has is sort of creating this, well, even architecturally, there's sort of this porch-like, you know, so you're coming, when you walk in, you know, you're with the porch, it's a welcome home, you know, and so these ideas around the images on the wall, the things that, you know, even to think about Spike Lee's, like, there are no images on the wall, where are the images on, you know, when it's from school days, this idea of making sure that you see yourself reflected in these spaces that have historically been a place where you did not feel welcome. And so that porch, when we all come to, you know, our family's home and we sit there on the porch, it's a place of respite. It's a place where you can feel like you can, people are there, understand you, they know you. And that's really kind of, I think, the way in which, for me, it's important to identify and bring that sort of sense of familiarity and aspiration and hope and desire and strength to the collection. We started with a collection of 0.
So let's talk about the collection a bit. When we met, I was curating at MoMA in New York, and the collection practice there is very different from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. The structure there is patrons helping you acquire work, galleries showcasing work that you then acquire. It is structured. Talk to us about this Smithsonian Museum model. How are images coming into the museum, and how does community enter into that?
Thank you for sort of bringing that to the fore. It's some of what you've described, yes, you know, the traditional model, but there's also this sense that, a belief that these museum quality objects are in the homes of our family and friends, and that was that kind of concept really has sort of blown the minds of many of my and our colleagues, right? Because, you know, I have a piece in the collection that is literally about, you know, what is that, 2 by 3 photo album, very unique image or photo album of tintypes, smallest tintypes, and they're in pristine condition of all of these African black soldiers from the Civil War. It is incredible, and it was in someone's home, in their home, in the laundry room. They had been, and they actually came to us with the lithographs that they had commissioned someone to take of these, and it was essentially their grandfather was the captain, this white captain of these soldiers, and it was not a point of pride for him to be the captain. It was always a sort of moment of, you know, disdain. However, he got sick while they were out on the battlefields. It was the soldiers who used plants and herbs and brought him back to life. He had that, he had a photograph session made so he could document all of the soldiers, and he kept that small photo album next to his lapel in his chest throughout his time as a captain and kept it in the family. This is the sort of thing that brings, I think, the American story, that is a story that bridges all types of people together and makes those connections. And it was through, literally, that was not a gallery, that was not a patron, but a query from, that someone reached out to me and said, is this something that you would be interested in?
So I think you put it this way in an interview with Jim Estrin in the New York Times. He was, we love Jim Estrin. He's doing incredible work, and we've been supported by him. But he said that there's some images that are appropriate for the gallery, and there's some for the gallery of the family reunion. It's
absolutely,
right? I was thinking about the importance of an image that came to us through the same kind of mechanism, the new image of Harriet Tubman, right? When I was speaking with Dr. Carla Hayden, our new Librarian of Congress, who's just extraordinary at the Annenberg Space Photography, where we both spoke. And can you tell us a bit about how that image came to the
Yes, that was one of those things where, again, we knew or learned that it was going to be up for auction, and there was a small sort of. The Auburn home in New York was like, we can't afford this. Would you please sort of consider this? And at the time, we were trying to figure out, working with the director, trying to cobble together resources, and Library of Congress reached out and said, we need to go in together on this. And we are both these institutions that receive federal funding. We want to make sure that this woman, who was literally a freedom fighter, has the chance to sort of be seen by the world, not in private hands. So, it was a wonderful opportunity to come together to create a sort of sense of showing how governments can work together and share resources. And it was a wonderful chance for us to literally have a 50-50 sort of shared opportunity to bring this beautiful photograph that had previously not been seen or even known it was in existence of a young Harriet Tubman. And for me, that then just sort of opens up our eyes about the narratives around her.
Sure, exactly. This image also was part of a family album as well.
Yes, I should say.
And so it came just through similar means, and it does give us a new sense of, and it lets us imagine the energy that we know she must have had, because when you see this image, if you haven't already, I encourage you to. It's at the museum.
Yes, it's at the museum.
Yeah, it is quite stunning, and it literalizes the idea we've been speaking about tonight about the inaugurative power of images to create new narratives, right, and understanding life.
Yep. And it's also, like you said, within this album, the Howland album, so you're talking about, you get the story of so many women and so many anti-slavery abolitionists who are in this, and young women of color, teachers, and so you have a whole sort of breadth. And that's the thing when you're looking at these family photos, that you understand, like you get into a whole generation of other sort of dynamics, like your grandfather, and then sort of the trajectory. Those are the things that are on the walls in people's homes and that are living and breathing history that help to fuel all of us, I would say.
And your grandmother as well. I was stunned that we both used images of our family.
Great vibes. Great vibes.
We need to write about this. But the title of the 1970 film, or is it created in 1969?
Yeah, she filmed it in 1969 and then actually came out.
Which happens.
Yes, that happens.
But the title, I Am Somebody, ultimately is really the epigraph for what we're speaking about here today. How do you inaugurate your sense of subjectivity, right, in this country? To transform oneself from being an object, an African American, to a subject. Photographs were crucial, and the moving image is crucial as well. And this is so much of what animates our work. I wonder about upcoming projects. Is there anything that if you had all the funding required, that you would that you want to talk about with 300 of your new closest friends that you'd like to do? What might it be, or what can we collaborate on?
Yes, what magic can you and I make, Sarah? That's what I think is most important. You know, I think that we're continuing to do this incredible work. There's so much taking place in terms of, you know, this moment that we're in right now. And I think that for me, I don't have an exact answer, I should say. I am hopeful that, you know, the work in terms of making sure we understand that there are women like Madeline Anderson out there, that there has been, you know, a century of image makers really focusing on righting these wrongs, understanding and inserting ourselves in that conversation. You've done it masterfully with Vision and Justice, and I would just hope to continue in some way, shape, or form in trying to do that work as well.
Great. Great. Well, I think we're going to find some ways to collaborate on it.
I would love that.
Definitely.
I wanted to ask you, we have a few more minutes left, and sort of that same question, if you will, in terms of what do you see this work doing? I mean, I was so grateful that I've had the chance to now be in Aperture and have a piece with Deborah Willis that's coming in this forthcoming family issue. It speaks very much to what is important for me, but in doing Vision and Justice, how do you see that sort of moving forward?
Well, what I'm about to say sounds as if I've sort of canned this answer, but this is on the spot. There are really three things. Well, the first is I hope that we inaugurate a new form of creative leadership in this field, and I want to give an example about what that means. The second, I hope that we can transform the ways in which arts organizations feel an allegiance to being more inclusive in representation as it relates to also staffing, and not just in terms of what's put out in terms of exhibitions and publications. And finally, I think that we need a form of civic education about this topic. So the first about creative leadership came to mind because I was just last week, I believe it was, asked to tribute an extraordinary leader, Agnes Gund, at the Aperture Gala, and her daughter, Kat Gund. She's an extraordinary filmmaker. And we were doing so at what was billed as the Family Gala. So we also attributed Deborah Willis and Hank Wells Thomas and Catherine Opie, who's done so much work in her photographs to allow us to image and expand the notion of family regarding queer families, right? So with Carrie Weems and Patricia Newkirk, we celebrated Deb and Hank.
That's incredible. My God.
It was great. But with Aggie, I offered a speech that was heartfelt. Of course, there are moments that I've had in my life in which she's let me think about leadership of a different kind. This is a woman who's an extraordinary arts patron. You might not know she has 12 grandchildren, 6 of whom are Black. Agnes Gund is white. And I think that she has, through, as she's told me, the lives of her grandchildren, seen circumstances of prejudice and bias and racism. And that's given her a kind of steeliness about not tolerating it. You know, when we first met, I was maybe 24, a curator at
14.
And I felt like a baby, really. And so much so I was stunned when she asked if I wanted to get lunch. I was a baby curator at MoMA. And so we did. It was one-on-one. And I walked into the restaurant, and who knows how I was dressed. I was professional, but who knows. And the person, the maitre d', was sort of dismissive of me. And what he didn't realize is that Aggie was right behind me. And she spotted what was happening, and she looked at me. I didn't know her yet. She said, you know, I have, and she told me about her grandchildren. She said, I have these grandchildren of color, and I will tell you, I cannot stand injustice of any kind. And I thought, who is this woman? Agnes Gund, as you might know, has recently gone on to create, through funding-wise, the Art for Justice initiative by selling her masterpiece, the title of the Roy Lichtenstein painting. She donated $100 million, proceeds of which to create this organization. I, for one, am not surprised. But what it does do is create a new model of what leadership means, and reminds us of the importance of the arts for creating these bridges to understanding the new tactics that we need to employ to create better models of understanding one another. So there's that. I hope Aggie's not the only one.
Absolutely.
It is to say, right?
Yeah.
And then in terms of institutions, with Aperture, I began to, with the vision justice issue, realize that the work could not just be a one-off. That work of being so deeply inclusive on the pages of the magazine needed to permeate the decisions that happen in the future and the staffing.
Yes.
You know, it's a largely white organization and they're extraordinary, but that has created a shift internally, which they've embraced, and it's been fantastic to see. That, I hope, can become a kind of signal for the field. We're doing work together in the future as well.
So vision and justice then becomes sort of a metaphor for these larger, sort of larger considerations.
That's right, exactly. And that's what I hope in the final piece is that we as a society come to see more. In April, I'm creating a convening, Vision and Justice as a convening, which will be a way to consider this topic through the vantage point of public servants, activists, artists, from Carrie Mae Weems, Anna Devere Smith, Brian Stevenson, all of whom will be there.
Incredible lineup of people who are doing this work in a variety of, sort of fields.
Yeah, so we'll document it, we will have a media project come out of it, which I hope will be of interest and do some good work in the world. So those are the three things I'd like to see happen, but they can't happen without collaboration and fellowship and conversations like this that move us forward. So I'm grateful that we could speak about this today.
Me too. Yeah. This has been fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you all so much. Thank you. So excited. So as we're about to go downstairs, I encourage you to sit with someone that you don't know. There are only 3 tables. There are 3 big tables, but find someone that you don't know. It is a very family-style dinner. You'll be passing food and start the conversation and get it warmed up for us, and we will see you downstairs. Thank you. If we don't get this computer... Were you still able to get photos?